It is a great honor to welcome Dr. Richard Clements on this podcast. He is a writer and a speaker. According to his website, richardclements.org, he writes and speaks about topics related to the Catholic faith with a particular focus on the ways in which a rediscovery of beauty, goodness, and truth can help to revitalize our lives and our culture. Today, we're discussing one of his books, The Meaning of the World is Love. Selected text from Hans Urs von Balthasar with commentary. Rick, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks, Chung. I'm good. How are you?
Yes, I'm doing quite well. I hope I get that introduction correctly.
Yes, thank you.
All right. So before we begin to talk about the main topic of this hour, which is von Balthasar, do you have any preliminary thoughts regarding the new Pope as well as the legacy of the previous Pope Francis?
Well, I have a great deal of hope for Pope Leo. I was very pleased with his choice of his papal name. I have great respect for Leo the 13th and the original Leo, Pope Leo the Great. And so I think that bodes well for, possible directions that Pope Leo intends to take the church in as he assumes leadership. Obviously, I was pleased to have an American. It was, I think, a great joy for many of us to have someone from the United States selected to be Pope. And I actually live near Chicago, and so there's lots of excitement around here since Pope Leo grew up on the south side of Chicago. And so, I think it'll be exciting to see what he brings to the papacy. And, I've been encouraged by his emphasis on peace and being a peacemaker so far in his initial speeches. So, I have great hope for him as our new leader. And as far as Pope Francis's legacy, I think that it's a tremendously difficult job, and I think that he did the best that he could according to his abilities. And it's a job that is so challenging and so demanding that I think everyone who assumes that responsibility deserves our thanks and our praise.
Certainly. Okay. So, von Balthasar, to what extent has he been an influence to the popes? I suppose from Paul the Sixth to this one.
He was Paul II and Benedict, also Paul the Sixth, even so, second Benedict. Pope Francis less so, but John Paul II are as his favorite theology, and Benedict something similar. Ben was a huge fan of Balthasar and his approach to the papacy and the emphases that they placed within their papacy. So, John Paul II had such great respect for Balthasar that he twice tried to name him cardinal. And the first time Balthasar declined, he was a humble man and he declined that honor. But John Paul II tried again, and Balthasar decided to accept. But unfortunately, he died to be created. And his friends say that was his way of still avoiding the honor. But that was the kind of respect that John Paul II had for him. Was he wanted Balthasar to help lead the church as a cardinal, and he wanted to recognize Balthasar's tremendous contributions as a theologian. Balthasar has been called by many people the greatest theologian of the 20th century, and I think John Paul II would certainly agree with that assessment. The same thing for Pope Benedict, who gave the eulogy at Balthasar's funeral. They just felt that he had brought new life and new energy into the church's theology with his emphasis on beauty, goodness, and truth. And as Karl Rahner once said, I think that Balthasar's influence on the church is only growing over time. Balthasar and Rahner were in some ways sort of theological opposites, you might say. But Rahner did have tremendous respect for Balthasar and said, he had so much insight that it was going to take decades for the church to absorb Balthasar's work. And also part of that, Balthasar wrote prolifically. There's over 60 books in English translated from Balthasar's work, and numerous articles, monographs, etc. So he was a tremendously productive writer and such depth to his writing that I think the church is going to continue to absorb his work. And both of those popes encouraged the church to continue to reflect on Balthasar's work and to, kind of mine its riches.
So how did you get introduced to his writing?
Yeah, I ran across a reference to Balthasar once in Journals, which is, for any listeners who might be, is an excellent journal that looks at the intersection of religion and public life, politics. Excellent journal. And so years ago, in reading that journal, there was a reference to Balthasar, and that was where I first heard of him, actually. So I started to read him on my own, and it's especially been the last 15 years that I've been reading all of his work and taking notes on, and just have really learned a tremendous amount from him. And so I turn back to his writings again and again because they bear rereading. Again, there's so much there. But it was that initial reference to him that kind of drew me to work. I like his writing style, and he is tremendously well read. He makes all kinds of references to philosophers, historians, playwrights, poets, of course, theologians. He was once called the most cultured man of the 20th century, and just very erudite. So I have learned such a tremendous amount from him, and I continue to learn from him.
I see. Yeah. Yeah, you refer to the journal First Things, right? That's the one.
Yes.
Yeah, I read that too frequently. It's amazing. I actually did a podcast on the thoughts of Father Newhouse too.
Oh, did you? Yeah, Richard John Newhouse.
Yes, who founded the journal.
That journal has done great work. They bring great insight into current events and politics and events in the church and so on.
Certainly, yeah. It's whenever I have like a theopolitical issue that I haven't made up my mind on, I just say, well, look at what First Things has to say.
Yes.
So as you've mentioned, Balthasar's written works are voluminous. So for those who are looking to get into or get introduced to his writings, where should they start?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Chung. I would name a few different books that they could choose among. One would be Heart of the World. That's my personal favorite. It is Balthasar's most personally devotional work, where his own personal faith comes through the most directly, and I would say in the most personal kind of way. It is, he described it as a hymn to Christ. It really just shows his tremendous connection with Jesus and his love for Jesus Christ. And I think his deep insight into Jesus's salvific mission in the world. So the title refers, of course, to Jesus as Heart of the World. And that is a very accessible way to start reading Balthasar because it is not dense with references to like other theologians and so on. It's a very readable work. Some other options would be Love Alone is Credible, which is a summary of one of his parts of the trilogy that he wrote on beauty, goodness, and truth. And as you're probably aware, that trilogy actually consists of several volumes. By calling it a trilogy, that's a reference to the three topics of beauty, goodness, and truth. But the part of the trilogy that is on beauty is 7 volumes, and the part that's on the good is 5 volumes, and the one on the truth is 3 volumes. So that's all very extensive. But if readers want an introduction to that trilogy before they actually tackle all those volumes, Love Alone is Credible is one of those introductions. There's another one called Engagement with God, another book by Balthasar that I would recommend. He wrote a book called My Work in Retrospect, which, as the title indicates, was him looking back on his career and giving a bit of an overview of his thought. So those are some that jump to mind. I would also mention The Threefold Garland. Balthasar's theology is deeply Marian, and The Threefold Garland is one of his works on Mary. And so I think that especially readers with a devotion to Mary or an interest in learning more about Mary would find that to be a good read. Let's see. I think those are good starting points, good entry points. But I certainly recommend anything that people can get their hands on from Balthasar. As I think about it, a couple other ones come to mind. There is one called "You Crown the Year with Goodness," which are kind of some homilies from him or reflections on some of the mass readings. So yeah, I think any of those would be good starting.
Okay, certainly. Now, I got to know Balthasar from Robert Barron, the great bishop.
Yes.
I
Yes.
actually did an episode on Bishop Barron also some time ago.
Oh, excellent.
And
Yes, Bishop Barron does fantastic work.
yeah, certainly. And one of Barron's key theological points that he took from Balthasar is the idea that or at least the hope that all men shall be saved. I think that's one of Balthasar's works that I'm most familiar with. Dare to Hope.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that text.
Yeah, you're right. That book, Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved. I'm glad you brought it up. That's one book that I think some people out there have misunderstood from Balthasar. Some people have accused Balthasar of being a universalist, that he teaches that all people will be saved in the end. But if you read that book, and including the introduction that Bishop Barron wrote to the latest edition of the book, you'll find it is a deeply scriptural book. Balthasar takes great pains to draw on the various strands of scripture about salvation and who might be saved and what we know about hell. And he is very clear that he is not a universalist. He is not trying to argue that all people will be saved. What he does argue, and I think why his book is titled what it is that we are called to hope and pray that all people will be saved. And unfortunately, people have misunderstood him on that, because it is very clear in that book that we do not know, only God knows who will be saved, and all people will be saved in the end. But he draws on various scriptures to emphasize God wants us to for that. And Bishop echoes, and that's I think why Bishop was right forward to that book is to emphasize what exactly Balthasar is trying to say. And it's unfortunate that people have understood, because actually in some of my conversations with people about Balthasar, I have found that some people are not very open to Balthasar's theology because they think he is a universalist, and therefore they've kind of shut themselves off to everything else he has to say. But number one, they're incorrect about thinking he's a universalist, and also that it's doubly unfortunate that they have then let that discourage them from reading his other work, because he has so much to contribute. One of the experts on Balthasar is Aidan Nichols, a Dominican priest, and Nichols speaks about how Balthasar touched him, personally, with his own theology being so rich and so dynamic. Aidan Nichols said, it brought new life to his faith, because he had been schooled in the emphasis on Aquinas within the church that was dominant in the early 20th century, that was very, he said, dry and not and kind of lifeless. That is not knocking Aquinas. It's talking about the way in which Aquinas was taught and what was emphasized from Aquinas's work. And so Nichols was saying Balthasar brought a new dynamism to the Catholic Church and the faith and the presentation of the gospel. And so it's really unfortunate that some people are judging Balthasar on a misunderstanding of what he had to say about salvation.
Yes, certainly. Now, what do you suppose will be Balthasar's most lasting contribution to Catholic theology?
Yeah, boy, I think he has many, many contributions, and so I want to be reflective about which one to pull out. Certainly one of the things he is most famous for is that emphasis on beauty, goodness, and truth, and especially beauty. So I hesitate to commit to only one great contribution, but I think maybe that's among the most important contributions for him, because Balthasar saw a great need for a return to beauty, that if we are to proclaim the gospel effectively in contemporary society, he felt one of the most effective ways to do that was through the path of beauty, because in part, beauty is more accessible for people. It's less threatening to start with the topic of beauty. If you want to try to start having a conversation with someone that, whether it begins by talking about religious faith or that might be kind of where that you think that conversation is headed, Balthasar believed that one of the most effective ways to have that conversation is to start with beauty and how beauty points to God, that there is a depth to beauty that can evoke wonder in people, wonder about the deep questions of life. What's it all about? What's the meaning of life? Why are we here? Why is all of this here? The whole cosmos, those sort of deep questions can be triggered by an experience of beauty. It touches people in a powerful way and provokes those kind of questions, but also wonder in another sense of amazement, being touched by the power of beauty and at an emotional level, that beauty having an impact on them. So I think that one of the most important ways that Balthasar can increase our ability to evangelize and to proclaim the gospel effectively these days is for us to focus on the beauty of God, of the faith, of the church's rich cultural heritage, the artwork, the sculpture, the literature, the poetry, the music, all of the rich inheritance that we have in the Catholic Church that speaks of the beauty of God and of our relationship with God. I think that is the most important element that we can draw from Balthasar currently. But, again, I think what he had to say about truth, tremendously important for our society, with the erosion of belief in the actual objectivity of truth. That started. There have been many currents that have led to skepticism about the truth, but you can certainly point to people like Nietzsche, of course, who said, there are no truths, there are only interpretations. If you look at those kind of statements, they're self-contradictory, of course. He's asserting the truth in the very act of trying to deny the truth. So people who make those kinds of accusations against objective truth are relying on truth to try to even make an accusation or a statement. That was something the philosopher Roger Scruton emphasized. I'm a big fan of Roger Scruton. And he said, to even have a conversation like we're having, to have any kind of discussion, you have to agree fundamentally that there is such a thing as reason and there is such a thing as truth. Otherwise, how can you have any sort of conversation? So Balthasar, I think, when you talk about the truth, has to say our society about the objective nature of truth. Truth is not what you want to believe it is, or it isn't what you merely it is. There is an objective reality out there. We try to turn in our for the
certainly. I should mention that I'm a great Roger Scruton fan too. Also did an episode on him.
Great. Yeah.
I live in Budapest, Hungary.
Another person I've learned a tremendous amount from Roger Scruton. As I said, this I get new insights every time. Just a deep thinker, and often great foresight in seeing trends before other people happening in society. Saw that ahead of other people. Just had this this tremendous into where society was heading. His comments were very much on target, often on culture and social changing these days.
I live in Budapest, Hungary, so there are like 3 cafes named after him. So Scruton cafes.
Are there really?
Yeah.
Yes, he did such great work in Eastern Europe to help fight communism, and just another one of his amazing contributions in his life. All of the work that he did over there.
Yes. So since you mentioned the necessary of, in some ways, belief or grounding in objective truth, I realized that the currents of Western philosophy has been, in some ways, anchored by this argument between those who believe or ground their ethics or their metaphysics in an objective truth and those who do not. You have the realists and the nominalists from pre-Christian Greece, and of course in the scholastic schools you have St. Thomas and William of Ockham, I believe.
Yes, that's right.
And what you're implying is that Balthasar is on the side of objective truth. So I wonder.
Yes, absolutely.
What can be the worst that can happen if you follow the position opposite him, that objective truth is not a notion that exists to its fullest extent?
Yes. Yeah, I think we see that very much in society today with the rise of nihilism. Sooner or later, people who deny objective truth find that they don't have any solid ground beneath their feet in their thinking, in the way they look at the world, in how to make choices in life. If there is no objective truth, everything's up for grabs. Dostoevsky in The Brothers Karamazov, the paraphrase, it's not the exact quote from the book, but he said, if God is, yeah, there you go. If God is dead, all things are permitted. And so part of what happens if you give up the objectivity of truth, then morality loses any solid base. Morality then becomes whatever you want it to be. And that, I think, is one of the tremendous corrosive agents in our society today, has been this loss of a grounding for morality, where people essentially feel free to do whatever their desire tells them to do. And only sometime down the road, not always immediately, but sometime down the road, does it start to become clear that that is not a life that leads to flourishing and to happiness. And I think one of the ways a person starts down that path is to begin questioning the objectivity of truth, and to just say, well, there is no truth out there. I'm just going to live my life the way I want to. And it's a recipe for disaster as an individual person and also as a culture.
Yes. So was that something that Balthasar saw in the 20th century?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that he was very troubled by the changes that he saw. I mentioned already that he read very widely, and he was very willing to read people who were critics of the faith, philosophers who were atheists, philosophers who did question the objectivity of truth. He read all of those thinkers, trying to pick out any truth that was there. So I think that Balthasar embodied the traditionally Catholic approach to finding truth wherever it might be. And so he would look at these thinkers and try to pull out the parts where they had hit upon something we need to look at, we need to think about. But he was very concerned about the impact of parts of their thought, like the rejection of truth, and what was going to think he need to write the trilogy to ground the truth in a deeply thoughtful work and to try to combat this modern and especially postmodern trend toward relativism. So, you asked earlier about the popes who were influenced by Balthasar, and that makes me think at this point of Benedict, because one of Pope Benedict the 16th's famous lines was about moral relativism. He spoke about that often, and I think some of that that discussion that Benedict engaged in about moral relativism was driven by the work of Balthasar. And Benedict spoke often about the damage that moral relativism has done to modern culture, what it's done to families, no fault divorce, and the loosening of morals in modern society, and even the rejection of any sort of absolute right and wrong. Just leaves many people adrift, without any sort of moral code to guide them. It might seem freeing at first, liberating to say that there's no right and wrong, and I can do whatever I want to do. But sooner or later, it stops feeling liberating and starts to feel chaotic. And generally, it's a mess of one's life and also a damage to society. And I think Pope Benedict tried very urgently to fight that trend in modern society, sort of following on the heels of Balthasar about that.
Yes, certainly. Now, another great new thinker in the Catholic tradition is Sohrab Ahmari. I've been enjoying reading his work for some time. In his memoir, From Fire by Water, he wrote about how reading about the life and death of Jesus, in some ways woke him up from the sort of like the slumber that is intellectual nihilism that he's been experiencing. He's been reading too much Nietzsche.
Yes.
And he believes that there is an absolute right and wrong in that, it is absolutely wrong for Jesus to be condemned to death, like the manner that he did. And of course, it is absolutely right that he is resurrected and he
Yes.
is now the light of the world. Um, I wonder, to what extent did Balthasar believe that, the effect of Jesus's death and resurrection is to, in some ways, awaken mankind from this slumber that is intellectual nihilism?
Yeah, I would definitely say Balthasar would agree with that. He wrote, I mean, of course, many, many times about the Paschal Mystery and the events of Holy Week in very profound ways. But I would bring up at this point one of his other famous works that we've not discussed yet, which was Mysterium Paschale, the Paschal Mystery. And that would be one of the works I would point to, in particular, if listeners want to get Balthasar's take on the meaning of the crucifixion and the resurrection and how that speaks to people today. Those events were seismic, the center of history. And if a person really looks at those events with an open mind and an open heart, they can hardly avoid having that impact that they had on Amari, that it's life-changing. And so I think, that work, Mysterium Paschale by Balthasar, was one of his attempts to write about the events of the crucifixion, the death, the resurrection of Jesus in a way that would be accessible to people, but deeply grounded in scripture and the tradition of the church, to again try to bring that to people today and have that sort of powerful impact in their lives.
Did Balthasar find any, how should I say it, ways that, say, Catholic theology in the early 20th century has fallen short of answering the rising tide of nihilism and relativism?
Yeah, one of the things that Balthasar writes about, when he was not one to talk a lot about his own life. Again, he was a pretty humble man, but he was a Jesuit, and in his Jesuit training, he got exposed to the kind of scholasticism that he found dry and lifeless, like I was referring to with Aidan Nichols, and it frustrated him. And he relates that when he was going through some of his theology training, he would plug his ears to block out the lecture, and he was reading St. Augustine. So in life, he found some of the ways in which the faith was being presented as so dry and so lifeless. And so I think that was one of the original initiatives or motivators for him to try to find a way to proclaim the gospel in a way that was more dynamic and lively. And I think that he felt like a manualist kind of approach that is really going to emphasize, that the faith is about don't do this, don't do that, is not a way to reach some people and many people today. Kind of going back to the idea of starting with beauty. If you try to start with morality, often it turns people away because they feel judged, and their immediate reaction can be like, who are you to tell me what's right and wrong? And, you're accusing me of being wrong. And so it turns many people away. And so I think that, again, by trying to turn theology and the church as a whole toward beauty, Balthasar, was trying to find a way to combat this initial emphasis that some theologians or some preachers might take, where it's about just morality, and said that all spiritual morality. In other words, I would take that to mean a person has to begin to have some kind of connection with God before discussions of morality can really reach them or can open to those. You have to be careful about taking any one quotation too and going too far with it. But I think for people that is that you have to have them get access to the faith in a different way before they become open to a deeper discussion about moral. And I think that's part of what Balthasar was to combat relativism, is to say, well, maybe we'll always start by talking about the moral code of Christianity. Let's talk about the beauty of God and creation and God's invitation to us to join in the divine life, to share in that divine life, as Peter says in his second letter, that God invites us to that participation in God's life and love. Let's present the faith in that way. And then the moral code starts to make more sense. It's not God trying to restrict our life and, it's all about limiting us and saying, don't do X, Y, or Z. It's to say what life is all about is love, the divine love, and the commandments, the moral code that is part of Christianity flows from who God is and what we need to be in our lives, how we need to conduct our lives to align ourselves with the divine love. And then people can start to see why it's wrong to abort a child, why it's wrong to commit adultery, why some of these other commandments that are emphasized in Christianity are there. They're guardrails, they're guidelines to a flourishing life. They're guidelines to a life with God. They're not just negatives that are meant to, spoil people's fun. So I think that, that was, again, part of how Balthasar was trying to combat relativism is how do we reach people today who have been raised in a culture that says everything is relative and you can decide what the truth is for you. And his, one of his answers was, let's try to reach people through the avenue of beauty.
So, what does Balthasar believe the church's role in the war should be?
Yeah, he was I think he was also a deep thinker about ecclesiology. And there, I want to frame my answer thoughtfully here. I guess one thing that jumps to mind is his reaction to Vatican II and his influence in Vatican II and beyond. There's no question that he sees the evangelizing mission of the church as first and foremost. The church is Jesus present in the world, the sacrament of Jesus, literally and figuratively. And Balthasar fought this tendency post-Vatican II to, claim that Vatican II was meant to bring about all these significant changes in the traditions of the church. And so I think that Balthasar tried to emphasize the teachings of Vatican II as really being more of a continuation of the tradition of the church than a rupture, as some people try to characterize it, but opening the church to the events of modernism and postmodern. So Balthasar wrote a book called Raising the Bastions, in which he was talking about the need for the church to be open to the changes that were taking in society and be reacting to those changes in a way that still effectively promotes the gospel. So that's what I'm trying to get to there is I think that Balthasar would say the church needs to speak to the times without giving in to the spirit of the times. I think in part that has been the battle in the church that's been going on after Vatican II. Is there are elements within the church that want to capitulate to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. And Balthasar and others tried to oppose that tendency and to say, no, we have an obligation as the church to not simply go along with the tides of society. We need to remain faithful to the deposit of the Catholic faith and to continue to teach that. So the church's role is often one that is countercultural in that regard. And so I think especially continuing today, that Balthasar would say that is a very important role the church plays in the world, which is to stand athwart some of the tides of the modern world and to present an opposing view that helps people to question sort of the many of the trends that are occurring in society, and to see that there's another way of looking at life and looking at the world.
Yes. I find that, as a young Catholic, there's always a sort of conflict between, keeping true to church teaching as well as to engage with the world. And
Yes.
of course, a question that is central to my faith life is, how do I know if what the church teaches, the parts of the church teaching that they oppose to what the world proclaims, is true? Say, why is it? Was it, I guess, true that, say, abortion is immoral, or why is it true that, two people of the same sex should not get married, et cetera, while the world proclaims otherwise, something like that?
Yeah, the church has this rich tradition of deep reflection on these moral issues for 2 millennia now, and the prohibition against abortion, for example, goes back to the earliest times of the church, the Didache, an early document from the church prohibits abortion. And for young people today, I would hope, again, open mind, open heart, to be willing to listen to those centuries of reflection about what the human person is, the dignity of the human person and of human life. We have a rich anthropology in the church that I think can speak to a lot of people today who are raised in a culture that cheapens the value of human life. And there is, again, a beauty to our teaching that every single human life has dignity and value. And so I think that anthropology is one of the ways that we can reach, especially young people today, to open their hearts and minds to what the church has to say about issues of morality. That our anthropology and our moral code is actually at the basis of some of the issues that are out there in culture today, like protecting the environment, for example, and caring for the poor and the oppressed. Much of that emphasis comes from a Judeo-Christian ethic, of course. And so I think that's another way of reaching young people to say, where that value of caring about the environment comes from is partly the Judeo-Christian teaching that creation was from God and was good, and that human beings were entrusted as stewards of that creation. So you see the depth of where those values come from, and that they're grounded in God and God's intentions for human beings. So I would hope that is a way to, again, try to reach people these days who do understandably have a lot of questions about where does a moral code come from? If you weren't raised in a family that taught you some sort of solid grounding in morality, we need to be empathetic with people, and try to find ways to talk with them that help them see where the church teaching comes from. And again, that it's meant to be life affirming, not life negating and life, spoiling everybody's fun. That's not morally about. It's about, Benedict XVI said, we're called to greatness. And that, I think, is an inspiring view of what human nature is and life called. But it's also demanding, it's supposed to not be sluggish and lazy and living only for ourselves. And, I think that's part of the resistance to Christianity these days, and has been since the beginning, that God has expectations for us, but they're expectations that lead to our good. And so I think, in all of those ways, we try to present the truths of the faith and the moral teaching of the church in ways that hopefully can connect with some of those questions that people have.
So I wonder if Balthasar wrote anything about how should the believer approach the cross.
Yes, he absolutely did. One of the main themes of his theology is that love is about the gift of self. And the book that I wrote about Balthasar's theology focuses on his theology of love, and he speaks very much about sacrifice, the necessary sacrifice of self in love, and connects that to the cross, that a deep meditation on Jesus's death on the cross and Jesus's self-sacrificial love deepens our own ability to be self-sacrificial. That, like I mentioned before, that's a way of aligning ourselves with who God is. I think that's one of Balthasar's profound messages, is that we are called to align ourselves as closely as possible with Jesus. And the cross, of course, is the center point of our faith, because that reveals that connection between love and our willingness to reach out to others in the way that Jesus did, in being willing to give of ourselves to the extent that Jesus did on the cross. Is, most of us are not called to martyrdom, of course, but there is this resistance in our society these days to sacrifice. And so I think that one of the messages that Balthasar has for us today is we are all called to a life of sacrifice. A lot of people don't want to hear that. We live in a culture that, advertising, etc., presents, the ideal life is one that focuses on yourself and pursuing your own pleasures. But God is a self-giving God. Divine love is the gift of God to the world and to human beings. And so our most fulfilling life is found in entering into that divine love, that self-gift to others in love, and the self-gift to God in response to God's gift to us.
Yeah. I wonder if the overwhelming atmosphere of cynicism, the sort of reaction to, well, love is not enough. You should care about certain material benefits like finance and such. Comes from the idea that does it come from the idea that all of that is not enough once you can never get enough money in the world, or the idea that once you get enough money in the world, there's nothing else for you?
Yeah. Balthasar taught in one of his discussions about the good, that finite goods can never satisfy us. And I think that's a message that would be really helpful for a lot of people to hear these days, because we are surrounded by advertising that says, this new car or this bigger house, this vacation, how happy those things are going to make you. Later, people find when they don't ultimately satisfy, and so they are good. Again, some people think, oh, that the church condemns earthly happiness. No, not at all. It's just that we are to have them in perspective. Finite goods are often good, but they're not the ultimate good. And so that, I think, is something that would benefit many people tremendously today, if they could approach earthly goods in the proper perspective. God gave them to us as gifts, but they are also meant to be pointers to a greater good, pointers to God. And it's a great temptation to just get immersed in the finite goods of the world, money, pleasure, possessions, fame, etc., and to have those blind you to the higher goods in life, such as our connection to God.
How can we notice the love that God has for us?
Yeah, I think that prayer is important. And, somebody who is not a person of faith yet, even the simplest turning to God, I think, helps to open that channel of love from God. It's always there. God is always knocking and wants us to know that love, but God respects our freedom. And so, I would say somebody who struggles with a lack of faith in God or a doubt about the divine love, the simplest prayer, turning to God, and saying, God, help me to see, help me to know you. Help me to know your presence in my life. Help me to see that. So that's one way. And another would be openness to the gift that life is, and that, again, beauty is. Looking around at nature and appreciating everyday aspects of life, the beauty of a sunset, or hearing a bird singing in the morning, and just appreciating the beauty of that, and letting that trigger the kind of questions that I mentioned earlier in our discussion about wonder. why is all that here? And appreciating the gift that it all is. And when you start to open yourself to the perspective of life as gift, where did it come? Where did I get my life? It opened that door to perceiving God's love. It makes me think of G.K. Chesterton. He once talked about birthday gifts, and he said, I can thank people for cigar that they gave me for my birthday, cigars or slippers. Who do I thank for my life? And I think in his own life, that was one of the factors in his conversion to Catholicism, was realizing the gift that his life was, and the gratitude that comes from that realization. So I think those are a couple of ways, being open to life as gift and nature as gift, and also the simplest kind of turning to God in prayer just opens our heart to the channel of the divine love.
Yes, certainly. Chesterton is one of my favorite writers. I think every time I, find my, fate well runs dry,
Mhm.
I return to his writings helps. Either his father
Yeah.
stories or his poetry or of course his great theological writing.
Yeah, just another great intellect in the church. God's blessed us with so many of these deep thinkers, and the saints and their profound faith and spirituality. The church has all of these riches. We need to draw on. We try to proclaim the gospel to people these days.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to end on this note, since we discussed earlier about Balthasar says, "Dare we hope." So how can we trust that God's love is infinite, while we don't even know that, if ever a loving God exists, he would want to save all creation. If he want to, he would. But how can we trust in God's love when we know for a fact that, some people may not make it?
Yeah, I don't, I don't take that as a any sort of reduction of the divine love, of God's love. It's more taking a look at human freedom there. And Balthasar does talk about this in the book Dare We Hope. I would say we don't know what's going to happen, and we need to allow ourselves to be carried by the hope and prayer that all people be saved, and to entrust the details to God. God is love, and it says in the Bible, God wills that all be saved, but God respects our freedom. Love is not love if it's not freely given and freely accepted. It's not genuine love. It has to be free on both sides, the giver and the receiver. And so that's the way I look at it, is that God respects our freedom. He gave us the freedom to say yes or no to his offer of his love. And Balthasar, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, we don't know what ways God might have of reaching people. And so we just have to pray and hope that in the end, everyone's heart will be open to God, and they will use their freedom to finally say yes. But, ultimately, the way I make sense of it is to say God gives us that choice because God respects us, our freedom that he gave us, enough that he is not going to override our freedom.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Dr. Richard Clements, for joining the show.
Thank you, Chung. I've enjoyed our conversation.